My in-laws forced me to sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, just because I'm a blue-collar worker. But when my name appeared on an $80 million acquisition on television, they immediately regretted it. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm William, and I need to tell you about the day I learned what my future in-laws really thought of me. It was 3 weeks before my wedding to Sarah, and I thought I was walking into a simple family dinner. Instead, I walked into an ambush that would define the next 5 years of my life. The Blackwood mansion sat on Hillcrest Drive like a monument to old money. As I pulled my 10-year-old pickup truck past the iron gates, I couldn't help but notice how out of place it looked next to Richard's Mercedes and Margaret's pristine BMW. The manicured lawns stretched endlessly, and the house itself looked like something from a magazine, all white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Sarah had been quiet during the drive over, fidgeting with her engagement ring in a way that should have warned me. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled that tight smile she used when she was nervous and said her parents wanted to discuss wedding details. I believed her. God, I was naive. Richard Blackwood answered the door wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of confident handshake that came from closing million-dollar deals. "William," he said, his voice cordial but cool. "Come in. We have some important matters to discuss." Margaret appeared beside him, elegant in that effortless way wealthy women seem to master. Her smile was perfect, practiced, and didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, dear," she said, air-kissing my cheek while somehow managing to avoid actual contact. "We're so glad you could make time for us." The dining room felt more like a boardroom. The long mahogany table could have seated 20 people, but tonight it was set for 4. Crystal glasses caught the light from an ornate chandelier, and the silverware looked like it belonged in a museum. I felt my work-calloused hands unconsciously curl into fists as I took my seat across from a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. "William," Richard began, cutting into his perfectly prepared salmon, "I'd like you to meet Charles Morrison, our family attorney. He's been with us for over 20 years. The lawyer nodded politely, but his eyes were already studying me like I was a specimen under a microscope. I looked at Sarah, confusion starting to creep in. She was staring at her plate, pushing food around without eating. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Well, dear, when 2 families come together, especially when there are significant differences in background, it's important to protect everyone's interests." The words hit me like a physical blow. Significant differences in background. I knew exactly what she meant. I was a construction worker. Sarah was a Blackwood. In their world, that made me a threat. "We'd like you to review this prenuptial agreement," Charles said, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. "It's quite standard for families of our standing." I opened the folder, and the words swam before my eyes. Legal jargon filled page after page, but certain phrases jumped out like neon signs. No claim to family assets, separate property maintenance, limited spousal support. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Sarah. "I thought we discussed this. I don't want your family's money." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from polite to calculating. "William, I've done some research on you. You work construction, you rent a small apartment, and your bank account shows less than $5,000 in savings. Can you see how this might concern us?" My face burned with shame and anger. They had investigated me. They had dug into my private finances, my life, my worth as a human being, and found me lacking. "I work hard for my money," I said quietly. "I may not have much, but I've never asked anyone for anything I didn't earn." "Of course not," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "And we admire that. But you have to understand our position. Sarah stands to inherit a considerable fortune. The family business, the properties, the investments, it's all quite substantial." Charles cleared his throat. "The agreement ensures that in the unlikely event of a divorce, family assets remain protected. It also outlines financial responsibilities during the marriage." I flipped through more pages, my heart sinking with each line. According to this document, I would have no claim to the house we'd been looking at, the one Sarah said we'd buy together. I couldn't make any financial decisions without family approval. Even if I contributed to mortgage payments or home improvements, I'd have no legal ownership. "This makes me sound like a hired hand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not at all," Richard replied smoothly. "It simply clarifies expectations. For instance, we've noticed you're quite skilled with home repairs. The agreement includes provisions for you to maintain the family properties in exchange for certain accommodations. Accommodations. They wanted me to be their personal handyman, working for free to earn my place in their family." The room felt like it was closing in on me. I looked at Sarah again, desperately hoping she'd say something, anything, to defend me. Instead, she finally spoke, her voice small and distant. "William, maybe we should just review it. It's really quite standard." Those words cut deeper than anything her parents had said. She knew. She had known this was coming, and she hadn't warned me. Worse, she agreed with them. "I need some air," I said, starting to stand. "Please sit down, William." Richard's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "We're not finished." I sat back down, feeling the weight of their expectations, their judgment, their complete and utter certainty that I was beneath them. Charles continued explaining clause after clause, each one designed to keep me in my place. No access to joint accounts without Sarah's permission, no claim to any property purchased during the marriage, no inheritance rights. Margaret leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "We want you to understand, William, this isn't personal. We simply believe in protecting what we've built over generations." But it felt personal. Every word, every clause, every condition was a reminder that I would never be good enough for their daughter, never be worthy of their family name. The meeting stretched on for 2 hours. 2 hours of legal language designed to strip away any financial security I might gain through marriage. 2 hours of polite smiles hiding naked contempt. 2 hours of Sarah sitting silently while her parents dissected my worth as a human being. When Charles finally closed the folder and slid a pen across the table, my hand trembled as I reached for it. This was my choice. Sign away my dignity and marry the woman I loved, or walk away from the only future I'd ever wanted. I signed my name on every page, watching my self-respect disappear with each stroke of the pen. Richard smiled for the first time that evening, a satisfied expression that made my stomach turn. Margaret actually clapped her hands together like I'd just performed a clever trick. As we prepared to leave, Richard placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Welcome to the family, son," he said, and the word son sounded like an insult in his mouth. Walking to my truck that night, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Sarah walked beside me in silence, probably relieved that the unpleasant business was over. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had just signed the document that would eventually destroy them all. But that realization was still 5 years away. That night, I just felt broken, humiliated, and completely alone, even with the woman I loved walking beside me. I had no idea that the very thing they were trying to protect themselves from would become their greatest regret. The 5 years following that prenuptial agreement were a masterclass in subtle humiliation. If I thought signing those papers was the end of my degradation, I was wrong. It was just the beginning. Sarah and I moved into the house on Maple Street, the one I thought we'd chosen together. What I discovered on our first mortgage statement was that my name wasn't on the deed. According to the prenup, even though I'd contribute to the monthly payments, the house would always belong solely to Sarah. When I questioned it, she just shrugged and said it was simpler for tax purposes. The house needed work. The kitchen cabinets were falling apart, the bathroom tiles were cracked, and the basement flooded every time it rained heavily. I spent my weekends tearing up floors, rewiring electrical systems, and painting room after room. I installed new fixtures, built custom shelving, and even added a deck to the back of the house. Every improvement I made increased the property value, property I would never own. Richard made sure I understood this dynamic. During one of his frequent visits, he found me installing new hardwood floors in the living room. "Beautiful work, William," he said, running his hand along the smooth oak planks. "You're really adding value to Sarah's investment." Sarah's investment, not our home, not our future. Her investment that I was improving with my sweat and skill. The family gatherings were the worst part. Every month, Margaret would host Sunday dinner at the mansion. These weren't casual family meals. They were performances where everyone played their assigned role. Richard would hold court at the head of the table, discussing his latest business deals with the confidence of a man who'd never known failure. Margaret would orchestrate the conversation like a conductor, steering discussions away from anything that might embarrass the family. And me, I was the working-class curiosity they'd collected. "William," Margaret would say during dessert, her voice bright with false interest, "tell us about your latest project. I find manual labor so fascinating." The way she said manual labor made it sound like I cleaned sewers for a living. I'd describe the office building I was helping construct or the renovations we were doing on a historic downtown building, and she'd nod politely while clearly thinking about something else. Richard preferred more direct approaches. "How's business, William? Still working with your hands?" he'd ask, then immediately turn to discuss the stock market with Sarah's cousin Marcus, who worked in finance. The message was clear. My work had no value in their world. Sarah's brother David was the worst. He'd graduated from Harvard Business School and worked for a consulting firm that charged companies millions of dollars to tell them things their own employees already knew. He treated me like an amusing pet. "Hey, Bill," he'd say, deliberately shortening my name despite my corrections. "My apartment's garbage disposal is making a weird noise. Think you could take a look next weekend?" It wasn't a request. In the Blackwood family, my time was considered freely available for their convenience. I fixed David's disposal, unclogged Margaret's master bathroom drain, installed a new ceiling fan in Richard's study, and painted the guest bedroom at the mansion. I never received payment, or even a proper thank you, just more requests. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving of our 3rd year of marriage. Margaret had assigned me to carve the turkey, positioning me at the head of the table with a carving knife and fork, playing the role of family provider while having no actual authority in the family. As I sliced through the perfectly roasted bird, Richard launched into one of his favorite topics. "You know, William, I've been thinking about your situation," he said, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "Have you ever considered going back to school? Maybe getting some business training?" The conversation around the table stopped. Everyone was listening now, waiting to see how I'd respond to being publicly evaluated and found lacking. "I'm good at what I do," I said carefully, focusing on the turkey to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. "Oh, absolutely," Margaret chimed in. "You're very skilled with your hands. But don't you want more? Don't you want to provide better for Sarah?" There it was, the suggestion that I wasn't providing adequately for my wife. Never mind that I worked 2 jobs, my regular construction work during the week and renovation projects on weekends. Never mind that I contributed 50% of our household expenses, while having no legal claim to anything we built together. "I think William is perfectly happy with his choices," Sarah said, but her voice was distant, automatic. She wasn't defending me. She was ending an uncomfortable conversation. "Of course," Richard said, raising his glass. "To each their own. Some people are born to lead, others to support." The distinction was clear. In the Blackwood universe, there were leaders and there were servants. I was firmly categorized as the latter. After dinner, while the family retreated to the living room for brandy and cigars, I found myself alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. This had become my role at family gatherings, the cleanup crew. Margaret would make vague offers to help, but somehow she always remembered an important phone call or urgent conversation that required her immediate attention. As I scrubbed wine glasses and stacked plates, I could hear their laughter from the other room. David was telling a story about closing a major deal, and everyone was celebrating his success. When I finished and joined them, the conversation shifted to safer topics, the weather, local events, anything that didn't require acknowledging that I had thoughts or opinions worth considering. The drive home was always silent. Sarah would stare out the passenger window, apparently lost in thought, while I replayed every slight and dismissal from the evening. When I tried to talk about how her family treated me, she'd sigh and say I was being too sensitive. "They're just set in their ways," she'd explain. "They don't mean anything by it." But they did mean something by it. Every comment, every assignment, every casual dismissal was designed to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. I was useful for fixing things and doing manual labor, but I wasn't family, I was staff. The worst part was watching Sarah adapt to their expectations. The woman I'd fallen in love with had been independent and strong-willed. She'd worked as a nurse before we married, and I'd admired her compassion and dedication. But gradually, she'd stopped working and started spending her days shopping with Margaret or meeting friends for lunch at expensive restaurants. She began referring to our money when discussing household expenses, even though she contributed nothing to our income. When I worked overtime to cover unexpected bills, She'd complained that I was never home. When I suggested she might want to return to nursing, she'd wave her hand dismissively and say the family didn't approve of wives working outside the home. I was supporting a lifestyle I couldn't afford while being excluded from the family that lifestyle was meant to impress. Every month I wrote checks for a mortgage on a house I'd never own, utility bills for rooms I'd renovated with my own hands, and insurance premiums for cars that weren't in my name. The prenup had been more than a legal document. It was a blueprint for my complete financial and emotional marginalization. I was a ghost in my own life, present but powerless, contributing but never belonging. What none of them knew was that while I was playing the role of the grateful servant, something else was happening, something that would change everything. But that discovery was still 2 years away, hidden in papers I didn't even know existed. For now, I just endured their contempt and waited for something to change, never imagining that I held the power to change everything myself. The truth came to me in the most unexpected way. I was cleaning out the garage on a rainy Saturday morning in our 4th year of marriage when I found the box that would change everything. Sarah had gone shopping with her mother, leaving me to tackle what she called spring cleaning, but what really amounted to organizing years of accumulated junk. Hidden behind old paint cans and Christmas decorations, I discovered a weathered cardboard box labeled Uncle Henry Estate Documents in Sarah's handwriting. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it contained old family papers that meant nothing to me. But something about the way it was hidden, pushed far back into a corner and covered with a tarp, made me curious. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Legal papers, correspondence, and financial statements, all related to my great-uncle Henry Mitchum, a man I barely remembered from my childhood. He died when I was 19, just after I'd graduated high school and started working construction. I remembered going to his funeral with my parents, but he'd seemed like a distant relative who'd lived a quiet life running a small construction company. What I discovered in that box was that Uncle Henry's small construction company had been worth considerably more than anyone in my family had realized. The estate documents showed that Mitchum Construction had been sold after his death for $8 million, and according to his will, everything was supposed to come to me. My hands shook as I read through the paperwork. Uncle Henry had no children of his own, and apparently I'd been his favorite nephew. The will was crystal clear. To my great-nephew, William Hendricks, who reminds me of myself at his age, I leave my entire estate, including all business assets, properties, and investments. But there was more, much more. Correspondence between Richard Blackwood and the estate attorney dated just 3 months before Sarah and I got engaged. Letters discussing the complexity of the inheritance and the need for proper management of the assets until I was ready to handle such responsibility. In one particularly damning letter, Richard had written, "Given William's current circumstances and lack of business experience, I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if the estate assets were managed by more experienced hands until he demonstrates the maturity to handle such a significant inheritance." Dar. The response from the estate attorney was equally revealing. "Mr. Blackwood, while I understand your concerns, the will is quite specific. However, if young Mr. Hendricks were to sign appropriate documentation transferring management authority, we could certainly accommodate such an arrangement." I sat on the concrete floor of my garage, surrounded by the evidence of my own family's betrayal, and felt my world collapse. They had known. Sarah, Richard, Margaret, they had all known about my inheritance before we ever got engaged. The prenuptial agreement wasn't about protecting their money from me. It was about protecting my money from me. There were bank statements showing that the inheritance had been placed in a trust fund with Richard as the primary trustee. For 4 years, while I'd been scraping together mortgage payments and working weekends to afford our lifestyle, there had been nearly $3 million sitting in an account with my name on it. Money I couldn't access because I'd unknowingly signed away my rights in what I thought was a simple prenuptial agreement. But the most devastating discovery was a handwritten note from Sarah to her father, dated just 2 weeks before our wedding. "Daddy, I'm having second thoughts about William. What if he finds out about Uncle Henry's money? What if he realizes what we've done?" Richard's response was attached. "Don't worry, sweetheart. He signed the papers. Even if he discovers the inheritance, the trust structure we've established means he can't access the funds without family approval. By the time he figures it out, if he ever does, it will be too late to matter." I read that exchange 3 times, each reading making me feel sicker. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved and trusted completely, had conspired with her family to steal my inheritance. Every kind word, every loving gesture, every moment of intimacy we'd shared had been built on a foundation of calculated deception. The papers showed that Richard had been using the trust funds to make investments, growing the portfolio while charging management fees that had enriched the Blackwood family accounts. My money had been funding their lifestyle for 4 years while I worked myself to exhaustion, trying to keep up with expenses I should never have had to bear. There were receipts mixed in with the legal documents. The renovation of the Blackwood Mansion's pool house, paid for with funds from my trust. Margaret's new BMW, financed through a loan secured by my inheritance. David's graduate school tuition, covered by distributions from assets that belonged to me. They had been living off my money while treating me like a charity case they'd graciously allowed into their family. The garage door opened, and Sarah walked in carrying shopping bags from expensive boutiques. She was laughing about something her mother had said, but her expression changed when she saw me sitting on the floor surrounded by papers. "What are you doing?" she asked, but her voice was already different, cautious in a way that told me she recognized the documents scattered around me. I held up Uncle Henry's will. "Tell me you didn't know about this." The color drained from her face. She set down her shopping bags slowly, like someone moving underwater. "William, I can explain." "Explain what? How you've been lying to me for 5 years? How your family has been stealing from me since before we even got married?" She sat down on an overturned paint bucket, her perfect composure cracking. "It wasn't stealing. The money was just being managed properly." "Managed properly?" I stood up, the papers clutched in my fists. "Sarah, this inheritance was worth almost $3 million. Your family has been using my money to pay for their lifestyle while I've been working 2 jobs to afford groceries. You wouldn't have known what to do with it," she said, and for the first time, I heard her parents' voices coming out of her mouth. "You were 19 when Uncle Henry died. You would have wasted it all. That wasn't your decision to make. It wasn't your family's decision to make." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, but they felt calculated, performed. "We were protecting you, William. We were protecting us. If you'd had all that money when we met, how would I have known if you really loved me?" The irony was staggering. She was asking how she would have known if I loved her for her money, while she had married me specifically because of mine. "You lied to me," I said quietly. "You all lied to me. You made me sign papers giving away my own inheritance, and then you let me believe I wasn't good enough for your family because I was poor." "You're not poor," she said desperately. "The money is still there. It's still growing. Daddy has been making excellent investments with my money, using my inheritance to make himself richer while I've been humiliated at every family dinner for the past 4 years. She stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped back. "William, please, we can fix this. We can transfer the money back to you. You can manage it yourself now." But it was too late for that. The damage wasn't just financial. It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. They had systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth while literally stealing my inheritance. They had made me feel grateful for scraps from a table set with my own money. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" I asked. She couldn't meet my eyes. We hoped you'd never need to know. The trust was set up to provide for both of us eventually." "Eventually? When Daddy thought you were ready, when you'd proven yourself." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Proven myself with what? My own money?" That evening, I sat in my truck outside the house I'd been renovating with my own hands, paid for with my own inheritance, and tried to process the magnitude of their betrayal. It wasn't just about the money, though nearly $3 million was life-changing. It was about the years of subtle humiliation, the constant reminders of my inadequacy, the careful orchestration of my shame. They had taken my inheritance and used it to build a prison around me, one where I was both the prisoner and, unknowingly, the architect. Every mortgage payment I'd made, every weekend I'd spent doing manual labor for their family, every moment I'd felt small and inadequate in their presence, all of it had been funded by money that was rightfully mine. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have anticipated, was that Uncle Henry's construction business had been more than they'd realized. Hidden in the bottom of that box was one final document that would change everything. A document that proved my inheritance was worth far more than even they had imagined. And tomorrow, that document would make me the wealthiest person in a family that had spent 4 years convincing me I was their poorest relation. The final document in Uncle Henry's box was a land deed that changed everything. It wasn't just for the property where his construction company had operated. It was for 847 acres of what had seemed like worthless farmland outside the city. Land that, according to the deed, contained mineral rights and had been quietly surveyed for commercial development potential. I spent 3 sleepless nights researching every detail of that property. What I discovered made my heart race. The city had been planning a massive commercial development project in that exact area for over 2 years. A consortium of developers had been quietly buying up surrounding properties, and Uncle Henry's land sat right in the middle of their planned shopping and entertainment complex. More importantly, a major corporation had been trying to acquire those mineral rights for months. They'd been sending letters to the estate attorney, offering increasingly larger sums for something they believed no one else knew existed. The latest offer, dated just 6 weeks ago, was for $80 million. $80 million for land that Richard and his estate attorney had dismissed as worthless agricultural property in their correspondence. I called the corporation's land acquisition department from my truck during my lunch break, my hands shaking as I dialed. When I identified myself as Henry Mitchum's heir and the legal owner of the property, the silence on the other end was deafening. "Mr. Hendricks," the voice finally said, "we've been trying to reach you for over a year. Are you interested in discussing our offer?" 3 days later, I signed the sale agreement in a downtown law office, surrounded by corporate lawyers and contracts that would transfer ownership of Uncle Henry's land for exactly $7 million. After taxes and legal fees, I would walk away with more money than I'd ever imagined possible, but I didn't tell anyone, not Sarah, not her family, not even my own parents. I wanted to see their faces when they discovered the truth the same way I had, unexpectedly and completely. The closing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. The announcement was scheduled for Monday morning. The corporation would hold a press conference to announce their latest acquisition, and my name would be mentioned as the seller who'd made the deal possible. That weekend, Sarah and I attended the monthly family dinner at the Blackwood mansion. I sat at their polished table, listening to Richard pontificate about market trends and investment strategies, knowing that in less than 48 hours, he'd discover that the construction worker he'd been managing and manipulating for 5 years had just become one of the wealthiest people in the state. Margaret was in particularly fine form that evening, discussing her latest charity committee work with the kind of casual superiority that suggested she was saving the world one fundraising gala at a time. "William," she said during dessert, her voice carrying that familiar tone of forced interest, "how are things at the construction site? Still building?" "Buildings?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied politely. "Still building buildings." David laughed. "Maybe you should think about branching out, Bill. There's good money in real estate if you know what you're doing." If only he knew what I'd been doing. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his brandy thoughtfully. "You know, William, I've been meaning to discuss something with you. The trust fund from your uncle's estate has been performing quite well. We might be able to arrange a small distribution soon." A small distribution from my own inheritance that he'd been managing and profiting from for 5 years. "That's generous of you," I said, keeping my voice level. "Well, family takes care of family," he replied with that satisfied smile that had always made my stomach turn. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. I went to work as usual, saying nothing to my co-workers about what was coming. At exactly 10 a.m., Hartwell Corporation held their press conference to announce the largest land acquisition in the region's history. I wasn't there. I was installing drywall in an office building downtown when my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Local news stations apparently wanting to interview the mystery landowner who'd just made the deal of the century. I let them all go to voicemail and continued working. The first call from the Blackwood family came at 11:30. Sarah's voice was shrill with panic. "William, where are you? You need to come home right now." "There's been some kind of mistake. The news is saying, they're saying you sold some land for millions of dollars. That's impossible, right? Right?" I didn't call her back. The second call came from Richard at 12:15. "William, we need to talk immediately. There seems to be some confusion about your uncle's estate. I'm sure we can clear this up quickly, but I need you to come to my office as soon as possible." I deleted the voicemail without finishing it. By 2 p.m., my phone had received 37 calls from various Blackwood family members and their associates. I turned it off and focused on my work, knowing that across town, a family that had spent 5 years treating me like their personal servant was discovering that they'd been stealing from someone who could have bought and sold them without blinking. When I finally got home that evening, Sarah's car was in the driveway, along with her parents' Mercedes. Through the living room window, I could see them pacing around, frantically, gesticulating wildly as they talked. I sat in my truck for a moment, savoring the scene. The moment I walked through the front door, they swarmed me like angry wasps. $82 million? Sarah shrieked. William, what the hell is going on? How could you sell land without telling us? It was my land, I said calmly, hanging my work jacket on the hook by the door. Richard's face was purple with rage. That land was part of the estate I've been managing. You had no right to make that decision without consultation. Actually, I had every right. It was my inheritance. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. But the trust, the management agreement, only covered the construction business assets, I said, pulling out the deed I'd found in their hidden box. The land was deeded separately, directly to me. It never went through the trust. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see their minds racing, calculating how much money had just slipped through their fingers, money they'd never actually owned but had clearly been counting on. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, her perfect composure completely shattered. $82 million, she whispered. You're worth $82 million. After taxes, I corrected. But yes. Richard was staring at me like I'd just sprouted a second head. You've been sitting on this information? For how long? I found out about the inheritance last weekend, I said, enjoying the way his jaw dropped. Of course, you've known about it for 5 years. Margaret actually gasped. How did you? Who told you about? I held up the box of documents. You really should have hidden this better. The next hour was a masterpiece of panic and desperate backpedaling. Richard tried to explain how the trust had been for my own protection. Margaret insisted they'd always planned to tell me about the inheritance when the time was right. Sarah alternated between crying and demanding to know why I'd hidden the sale from her. But the most beautiful moment came when David arrived, having apparently been summoned by frantic phone calls from his parents. He walked into the living room with his usual cocky swagger, ready to help manage whatever crisis had erupted. "Hey, Bill," he said, apparently oblivious to the tension in the room. Mom said there was some kind of problem with Uncle Henry's estate. Don't worry, I've got connections in corporate law. We'll get this sorted out. Actually, I said, there's no problem. I just sold some land for $82 million. David laughed. Right, very funny. But seriously, what's the actual issue here? I pulled out my phone and showed him the news article that had been published that afternoon. His expression shifted from amusement to confusion to absolute shock as he read. This is real? He stammered. Very real. But you're a construction worker. I'm a construction worker worth $82 million. The room fell silent again. 5 people who had spent years making me feel small and insignificant were suddenly forced to confront the reality that I was now wealthier than all of them combined. Richard cleared his throat, his businessman's instincts finally kicking in. Well, this changes things, of course. We'll need to restructure the trust arrangements, establish proper investment strategies. No, I said quietly. No, I don't need your management services anymore. The implications of that statement hung in the air like smoke. For 5 years, they'd controlled my money and my life through manipulation and deception. Now the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that they couldn't even comprehend it. Margaret tried one last desperate gambit. William, dear, you have to understand that managing this kind of wealth requires experience, expertise. I'll figure it out, I said, standing up from the chair I'd been sitting in. After all, I've got plenty of time now. Time? Sarah asked weakly. I quit my construction job this afternoon. Turns out I don't need to work weekends anymore. As I walked toward the bedroom to pack a bag, I could hear them whispering frantically behind me, but their whispers no longer had any power over me. The man who had signed that prenuptial agreement 5 years ago no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had just realized that he'd never needed their approval, their acceptance, or their love. He'd never needed them at all. For 3 days after the announcement, I stayed at a hotel downtown while the Blackwood family tried to process their new reality. My phone never stopped ringing. Sarah called 17 times the first day alone, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry demands that I come home and discuss this like adults. Richard left exactly one message, his voice carefully controlled. William, we need to meet. There are legal implications to your recent actions that require immediate attention. Legal implications. Even now, he was trying to find a way to control me through intimidation and fear. I didn't return any of their calls. Instead, I spent those 3 days meeting with new lawyers, financial advisors, and accountants. People who had no connection to the Blackwood family and no agenda beyond helping me protect my newfound wealth. The conversations were refreshing in their honesty. These professionals treated me with respect not because of who I was married to or which family I belonged to, but because I was their client. When I finally returned to the house on Maple Street, I wasn't surprised to find Richard's Mercedes in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see him sitting at my kitchen table, the table I'd built with my own hands in what I'd foolishly thought was my own home. Sarah met me at the door, her eyes red from crying. "William, thank God you're back. We've been so worried." "Have you?" I asked, stepping past her into the house I'd been paying for with my own stolen inheritance. The living room had been transformed into what looked like a business meeting. Richard sat at the head of my dining table with legal documents spread out in front of him. Margaret perched on the edge of the couch, looking like she was attending a funeral. David stood by the window, apparently serving as lookout for his father's latest scheme. "William," Richard said, standing to greet me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good to see you. We have a lot to discuss." I remained standing. "Do we?" "Please, sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair they'd positioned to face them all. "We're family. We can work through this together." Family. The word felt like a joke after everything I'd discovered. I stayed on my feet. "What do you want?" Richard cleared his throat, shifting into the tone he used for business negotiations. "Well, first, congratulations on the land sale. It was quite a windfall, thank you. However," he continued, "there are some complications we need to address. The prenuptial agreement you signed contains provisions that affect how marital assets are handled, including any significant financial changes during the marriage." I almost laughed. Even now, he was trying to find a legal loophole to get his hands on my money. "The land sale proceeds aren't marital assets," I said calmly. "The property was deeded directly to me before the marriage. It was never part of any marital estate." David stepped forward, clearly having been coached for this moment. "Actually, Bill, any appreciation in value of premarital assets during the marriage can be considered marital property under certain circumstances." "Is that so?" "It's complicated," Richard said smoothly, "which is why we think it would be best to handle this quietly, within the family. No need for expensive litigation that would benefit no one." There it was. They were threatening to sue me for my own inheritance, hoping to scare me into sharing money they'd already stolen from me for 5 years. Sarah moved to stand beside her father, presenting a united front. "William, we just want what's fair, what's best for everyone." "What would be fair," I said quietly, "is if you returned the $3 million you've been managing without my knowledge or consent for the past 5 years. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. No one had expected me to make that demand. Richard's mask of reasonableness slipped slightly. "The trust fund has been professionally managed according to legal guidelines. Every transaction has been documented and approved." "Approved by whom? I never approved anything." "You signed the management agreement," Margaret said quickly. "I signed a prenuptial agreement. I never signed anything giving you control over my inheritance." David pulled out a folder and handed it to his father. "Actually, you did. It's right here in the subsidiary clauses." Richard opened the folder and pulled out a document. Section 12, subsection C, clearly states that any inherited assets requiring professional management during the marriage term will be administered through appropriate family trustees. I held out my hand. "Let me see that." For a moment, Richard hesitated. Then he handed me the papers, probably figuring that the legal language would intimidate me into compliance. But I'd spent the past 3 days with lawyers who'd been very thorough in explaining exactly what I'd signed 5 years ago. I knew these documents better than Richard realized. "This clause," I said, pointing to the section he'd referenced, "specifically applies to assets requiring active management. Land ownership doesn't require active management. It just requires ownership." "That's debatable," David said. "No, it's not. I had 3 different attorneys review this agreement this week. The land deed was never subject to the trust provisions. The silence that followed was thick with tension. They were running out of legal options and they knew it. Margaret tried a different approach. "William, sweetheart, you have to understand our position. For 5 years we've been treating you like our own son." "Have you?" I asked. "Of course we have. We've welcomed you into our family, included you in everything." I looked around the room at these people who'd spent 5 years making me feel like an outsider in my own life. "You've included me in everything? Really?" "Yes," she said defensively. You mean like when you discussed Sarah's trust fund last Christmas, and I was sent to the kitchen to make coffee? Margaret blinked. That was private family business. I am family, or I was, according to you. You are family, Sarah said desperately. That's why we can work this out. That's why we don't need lawyers and courts and all this ugliness. Sarah, I said, turning to look at the woman I'd thought I loved. What do you think we should work out? Well, a fair division of the money, something that acknowledges both of our contributions to the marriage. What contributions? She looked confused, as if the answer was obvious. My contributions. The house, the lifestyle, the social connections. The house that I've been paying for with my own inheritance money while doing all the maintenance work myself? That's not. You don't understand how expensive it is to maintain our standard of living. Our standard of living. The standard of living that had been funded entirely by money stolen from me. Richard stood up, apparently deciding that subtlety wasn't working. William, let's be frank. You've stumbled into a windfall, but you have no experience managing this kind of wealth. You need guidance. You need family. Do I? Yes. And we're offering to help you. We're offering to continue managing your assets, with appropriate adjustments to reflect your new circumstances. Appropriate adjustments? A more favorable fee structure, Margaret added quickly. More input on investment decisions. They were offering to steal less of my money while giving me slightly more input into how they spent it. The audacity was breathtaking. I have a different proposal, I said. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, hope flickering in their eyes. You transfer the $3 million from the trust fund back to me immediately, along with detailed accounting of how my money has been used for the past 5 years. You remove my name from all documents related to this house, since it was purchased with my inheritance without my knowledge, and you never contact me again. The hope died quickly. That's unreasonable, Richard stammered. Is it? You've had access to my money for 5 years. You've charged management fees, made investments, and funded your family's lifestyle with my inheritance. I'm asking for my own money back. You can't just walk away from your marriage, Sarah said, her voice rising. Watch me. David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You think you can just buy your way out of your responsibilities? You think money makes you better than us? No, I said calmly. I think honesty makes me better than you. Margaret gasped. How dare you? How dare I what? How dare I want my own inheritance? How dare I object to being lied to and manipulated for 5 years? How dare I refuse to be grateful for being robbed by my own family? Richard's businessman facade finally cracked completely. You ungrateful bastard. We gave you everything. We brought you into our family, gave you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. You gave me nothing, I said, my voice deadly quiet. You took everything. We made you who you are. No, I said, picking up my truck keys from the counter. You showed me who you are. I walked toward the front door, leaving them standing in the living room like actors who'd forgotten their lines. Where are you going? Sarah called after me. I paused at the threshold and turned back one last time. I'm going to live my life, without any of you in it. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I could see them through the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway looking lost and confused. For 5 years, they'd controlled every aspect of my existence through manipulation, deception, and financial leverage. Now they had no power over me at all. And judging by the frantic phone calls that started within minutes of my departure, they were finally beginning to understand what they'd lost. Chapter 6. The Deserved Liberation. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the house I'd built for myself. Really built, from foundation to roof, with my own hands and my own money. The property sat on 50 acres of Colorado mountain land, surrounded by pine trees and absolute silence. No neighbors, no family obligations, no one expecting anything from me except myself. The Blackwood family had tried everything in those first few months: legal threats, emotional manipulation, and finally, desperate attempts at reconciliation. Richard had actually shown up at my hotel in Denver, claiming he wanted to make things right. I'd refused to see him. Sarah had written letters, long, rambling things that alternated between apology and accusation. She was sorry for the deception, but I had to understand their position. She loved me, but I was being unreasonable. She wanted to work things out, but only if I was willing to be fair about the money. I'd read the first few letters, then started throwing them away unopened. There was nothing she could say that would change what they'd done or who they really were. The divorce had been surprisingly simple. My lawyers had been very thorough in documenting the fraud and deception around my inheritance. When Sarah's attorneys realized how much evidence I had of the family's manipulation, they'd advised her to accept my settlement offer quickly and quietly. I'd been generous, perhaps more generous than I should have been. I'd given her the house on Maple Street, the one I'd been unknowingly buying with my own stolen money, along with enough cash to maintain her lifestyle for several years. In return, she'd signed documents releasing any claim to my inheritance and agreeing never to discuss our marriage publicly. Margaret had called that settlement extremely fair, apparently forgetting that she was talking about my own money being returned to me. The final legal loose end had been the trust fund. My attorneys had demanded a complete accounting of every transaction, every fee, every investment made with my inheritance over the past 5 years. The results had been exactly what I'd expected. The Blackwood family had been living off my money while charging me for the privilege. Richard had paid back the principal amount. He'd had no choice once the courts got involved. But the 5 years of management fees, personal expenses, and family loans he'd funded with my inheritance were gone forever. Justice, I'd learned, had its limits. I didn't care. I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and more importantly, I had something I'd never had before, complete freedom. The construction business I'd started was thriving. Turns out, when you don't have to worry about money, you can be very selective about your projects. I only took jobs that interested me, custom homes for clients who appreciated craftsmanship, restoration projects for historic buildings, work that challenged my skills rather than just paying my bills. Word had gotten around that I was the millionaire contractor who'd made headlines with the land sale. Some potential clients were impressed by the story. Others were just curious to meet the man who'd outsmarted one of the city's most prominent families. I didn't mind either reaction. I let my work speak for itself. The best part was the silence. No more family dinners where I was treated like an amusing pet. No more weekend projects for people who didn't appreciate my efforts. No more sleeping next to someone who'd been lying to me for years. Just quiet mornings with coffee on my deck, challenging work that I enjoyed, and evenings spent reading or working on my own projects. I'd thought about remarrying, but the idea felt premature. 5 years of manipulation had left me wary of trusting anyone completely. Maybe someday I'd meet someone who wanted to be with me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. For now, I was content with my own company. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Blackwood family had spent 5 years trying to teach me my place in their hierarchy. They'd wanted me to understand that I was beneath them, dependent on their generosity, grateful for their acceptance. Instead, they'd taught me that I didn't need them at all. I'd gotten a Christmas card from David last year. The envelope was expensive, the kind Margaret would have chosen, and inside was a formal holiday greeting with a handwritten note. "Hope you're doing well, Bill. Maybe we can get together sometime and catch up." I'd thrown it away without responding. Some bridges once burned should stay burned. 3 months ago, I'd run into Sarah at a coffee shop in Denver. She'd been with her mother, both of them dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothes that screamed, "We're still wealthy, just not as wealthy as we used to be." They'd seen me before I could leave, and Sarah had approached my table with a nervous smile. "William," she'd said, "you look good." I'd nodded politely. "Sarah, how are you? How's the new business?" "Fine." Margaret had hovered behind her daughter, clearly wanting to say something but smart enough to stay quiet. The silence stretched until Sarah finally asked the question she'd probably been dying to ask for months. "Are you happy?" I'd looked at her then, really looked at her, trying to remember what I'd once loved about this woman who'd helped steal my inheritance and manipulate my life. She was still beautiful, still perfectly put together, but there was something different about her, something smaller. "Yes," I'd said simply, "I am." Her face had crumpled slightly, as if my happiness was somehow unfair to her. "I miss you," she'd whispered. "Do you miss me, or do you miss my money?" She'd flinched and walked away without answering. That encounter had confirmed what I'd already known. I'd made the right choice. Sarah didn't miss our marriage. She missed the financial security it had provided. She didn't love me. She loved the lifestyle I'd unknowingly funded. Now, sitting on my deck as the sun set behind the mountains, I felt a peace I'd never experienced during my years with the Blackwood family. My phone sat silent beside me. No demanding calls, no guilt trips, No one expecting me to fix their problems or fund their lifestyle. I'd built this house with my own hands, bought this land with my own money, and filled my days with work that satisfied me. For the first time in my adult life, everything I had was actually mine. The Blackwood family had tried to steal my inheritance, but they'd given me something far more valuable in return. They'd shown me that I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. I didn't need to prove my worth to people who would never truly value me. I didn't need to sacrifice my dignity for the illusion of belonging. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would have happened if I'd never found that box in the garage. Would I have spent the rest of my life working 2 jobs to fund a lifestyle built on my own stolen money? Would I have continued accepting their subtle humiliations, grateful for whatever scraps of affection they threw my way? The thought made me shudder. Instead, I'd learned that the most powerful form of revenge wasn't anger or confrontation. It was indifference. It was building a life so satisfying that the people who'd hurt you became irrelevant. It was achieving a happiness so complete that their approval became meaningless. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard's investment firm was struggling. Apparently, losing access to my inheritance had affected his cash flow more than he'd anticipated. Margaret's charity work had been scaled back significantly. David had moved back in with his parents after his consulting business failed. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no sympathy either. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. As for me, I was living with the consequences of my choices too. The choice to walk away from people who didn't value me. The choice to build something real with my own hands and my own money. The choice to prioritize my own happiness over other people's expectations. Tomorrow I'd wake up in a house I'd built, on land I'd bought, surrounded by the peaceful silence of mountains that belonged to no one and everyone. I'd drink coffee from a mug I'd made in my own pottery workshop, eat breakfast at a table I'd carved from trees on my own property, and spend the day working on projects that challenged and satisfied me. It was, I realized, exactly the life I would have chosen if I'd been brave enough to choose it years ago. The Blackwood family had taught me many things during our years together. They'd taught me that family wasn't always about blood or marriage. They'd taught me that money couldn't buy respect, but the lack of it could be used as a weapon. They taught me that some people would always see kindness as weakness and generosity as obligation. Most importantly, they'd taught me that I deserved better, and now, finally, I had it. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.